Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. This series is on the non-Western biblical origin of time. And it's very specific. What we're doing is applying the first part of the lecture series, Culture, what we learned about the 21 differences that we had observed between a Western and non-Western point of standpoint, and how those differences influence thinking patterns, and how those thinking patterns then influence how one perceives the world around them. And so what this video series, what we're in right now, is a non-Western, taking up the non-Western perspective standpoint of biblical parameters on the origin of time. There's been many commentaries, there's been many opinions expressed about biblical parameters and the accommodating different thoughts of time, how much time there is, and those are all interesting different strategies of trying to accommodate a biblical parameter with a modern Western scientific thought base. And what we're coming from is actually two different perspectives. We're coming from a non-Western perspective, which has a different thought pattern than the Western. And that's what we want to go over in this series, or in this lecture series, is on the origin of time. And actually it's not really just the origin of time, but what we're looking at is the origin of time and the origin of the debate over how much time. And we're going to be looking at what is involved and how do we know how much time was involved, and really what does it matter. So those are the questions that we're going to be going over in this series of lectures on the origin of time from a biblical parameter. But first, what I want to do is continue to go over our basis, or the quote that has been the focus point in this series, and that's by Stephen Jay Gould, and where he had quoted saying that first facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. Just to sum up what that may be saying is that data or facts do not come to us as just a package deal, and it's not seen, the facts are not interpreted the same by all reasonable people. So there are, and we can be reasonable and interpret things differently. And he says, well, why does that happen? Well, he says there's four factors involved, and those are theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. And so this is just a diagram put together just to try and illustrate what Stephen Jay Gould is saying, is that first we have question marks, we have questions. The world in itself, we don't understand a lot about the world, and how it got here, how I got here, what we're doing here, what we should do in between. And so what we do is we invite the expert in to tell us or to study the data, and then he or she gives us the conclusions. And you can see the conclusions are a kind of a colored line which represent those four factors that Stephen Jay Gould has mentioned, those four factors that go into the interpretation process. And so that is why there are different sciences, different scientists that come up with different opinions up top here, because they have different theory, habits, prejudice, and culture from what they're coming from that colors and that kind of just tints their interpretation process. What we had seen before is that in the previous lecture series is that in the process, well, we'll get there. Let's go ahead with this the tendencies. the cultural tendencies that we're working with. We said that it's a non-Western cultural tendency, and the question might be, well, what does that mean? Well, there was, in the first series on culture, we went over 21 differences that I had noticed and observed between my students and myself, and that what impeded the learning process, because our cultural tendencies, standpoints were really different. And to overcome those barriers, I had to understand what the differences were and try to tailor the teaching process to those differences. So what were and are some of the differences? Well, in this case, some of the important differences of the 21. The first one is the universal domains again, is that a non-Westerner really believes, is spiritually based, and believes that everything was created, there is a creator, and that creator and what was created inhabit the same world. They are in the same domain. There's not separate domains of a natural domain and a supernatural domain. They believe in a one singular domain that is inhabited by the created elements, the creator and the created elements. Number two is, because the creator is within the system is open basically to the influences of the creator and everything that was created. There were different created entities that have powers, limited powers, created powers that were given to them, but they do have powers to influence over the physical created world. So that's number two, is that it's an open system and it's governed by the creator, or other created power sources can influence in it. This is the way of thinking, and that's why they ask for permission, the non-Westerners, when they're going hunting or when they're going fishing or when they're chopping down trees and clearing and building homes. They ask permission from the power that is over those areas, over the waters, over the fields, the trees, and over the ground, is that they often ask for permission to do this to that area. And so they respect and that there are powers. So they are believers. They're very strong believers with their belief integrated into their practice, into their daily practices. Number three, the source of reference, we've gone over before, is historical. In other words, what they learn by is by remembering events of the past. They're very concrete thinkers, very visually orientated and historically based, in that their belief system, their belief about God, their belief about the spirits is based on experience, is based on, and that is similar to the Hebrew culture, which their God was the God of Abraham and Isaac and then Jacob and Joseph, and it just keeps going because it is a historical based belief system, and it is based on experience. In this series, how we're touching time, we're going to talk a little about time, and time in the 21 points in the first part of the lecture series on culture. We learned that there are two different concepts of time. There is a concept of time that's called kairos, and the concept of time called chronos. And the Western culture is very chronos-based, chronology. It's very marked. It's very mechanical. It's very quantity based. Whereas in kairos, a lot of other non-Western cultures are very kairos-based, which means they're event-orientated. They're quality of time, not quantity. And so that when you're trying to stay on a schedule, a Western time schedule in a non-Western culture, it can be frustrating. But at the same time, when the event does start, it doesn't end in a non-Western way. It does not end when the clock strikes the number. I mean, if they continue. In other words, they value the person, they value the event over the mechanical markings. So in this series, we're talking about time. So what we need to do is take in consideration that different cultures have different concepts of the importance of time. So what would be again, the source of knowledge, reliable knowledge for us to go into to understand the concept of time. Again, we're going for number 2, which is the external locus of authority, which is authoritarian. It's the authority is external, and so they look to an external authority for the questions that they have. Now there's 4 recognized sources: the intuitive source, authoritarian, the logical, and the empirical. Those are 4 recognized sources of knowledge in the philosophical field. And what we're focusing in as believers and as looking to an external source, so our source on time is authority-based. So we're building a structure, and what we keep doing is we keep emphasizing that whatever topic we're looking at is that we need to recognize that we are looking at it from a perspective, either our perspective or their perspective. And what we're doing is we're building the perspective of the original culture that generated the historical events, and how they looked at things and what they thought of them. And so what we're doing is we're building a house, and when you build a house, you don't often think of what's under it, the dirt, the lot. And so what we're doing is we're establishing the fact that it's very important to remember the culture and the tendencies that are under this house, and that is called the Weltbild in the German Welt concepts. The Weltbild. So you have a non-Western cultural tendency, and the foundation, what is the source of reliable knowledge? It is revealed. It's revelation. It is biblical, and so it is external source, and it's an open system. So those are what we could have is revealed knowledge, though, and that's what we're going to be looking at, is that revealed knowledge, even though it is revealed, we still have to perceive it, and we still have to process it. And so even though it's a direct revelation, whether it be a revelation that is special, which is God directly communicating and thus then written down into what we have today, into the scriptures, or whether it be general revelation through God's creation. Those are the 2 different types of revelation. Those 2 types still require a type of processing, a type of interpreting to understand it. And what we're saying is that when we do interpret Scripture, it's called hermeneutics, the rules of hermeneutics, the principles of hermeneutics, you can differentiate different groups of people by their hermeneutical rules or principles. They have different rules. What we have not really discussed much or thought about is that there is special revelation, and we know that's hermeneutics. It has interpretation rules difference. But what about general revelation of the creation? Do we use hermeneutics in that interpretation process? And I would say yes, and that those rules should be the same whether we're interpreting Scripture or interpreting nature, or not nature, but the creation itself, the physical world that was created. We need to imply or apply the same rules, the principles. And there's confusion that comes in when we apply one set of rules for scriptures and then we accept someone else's interpretation of the physical world who uses different rules to interpret the world by. And so that is where confusion can come in, and what just trying to emphasize is that there are rules involved. There's 4 factors involved, as Stephen Jay Gould said. There's 4 factors involved in that. There's theory, habit, prejudice, and culture, and we need to understand and where we are coming from. Where do we stand? What is my standpoint? And so what can I accept from somebody else's interpretation process? So that is what we're trying to do, is just equip to be able to understand where different interpretations are coming from. Okay, thanks again for joining, and we're going to continue. This is going to be another 5-part series on the origin of time. And we're Tim and Holly. You can contact us through the addresses that are here. But thanks again. Thanks again for joining me. And this is a 5-part series, so hope to see you in the next one.